Top 5 3D Zelda games in no particular order.
Wind Waker is considered by many to be one of the greatest games of all time. The differences between the HD and normal versions are few in number, but not negligible. HD offers a faster sail and shortens the Triforce quest at the end of the game. While the developers and many critics think these are improvements, one would have to evaluate how they relate to other aspects of the game and come to a conclusion about which better fits the experience. Ignoring these differences, the Wind Waker games both excel in the visual department. Wind Waker's art style holds up all the way back from 2002, and the HD remake only solidifies it as one of the most beautiful games ever made. The sailing is arguably what makes the game magical. Wanting to explore the world and add an element of player choice to the game, and avoid loading times, the game is set on a series of islands and a giant ocean. The weather effects, especially in the ocean, go a long way in allowing the player to really feel what's going on screen. Juxtaposed with sailing alongside wildlife like fish and seagulls, it's clear that the ocean is meant to make the player feel comforted and afraid, set on a determined quest, or lost in the middle of nowhere. These couldn't be replicated if not for the ocean setting, making it clear that Wind Waker is focused on the adventure between dungeons and the environment more so than past Zelda entries. Speaking of past Zelda entries, Ocarina of Time is considered by many to be one of the greatest games of all time. I would argue that Ocarina should be the first Zelda game that someone plays, and even the first game someone should play ever. I could go on and on about the brilliance of certain aspects of the game design, but I'll focus on how it introduces the audience to the concept of gaming at all. The first thing you do in the game is control Link from the top down. Your first steps are in 2 dimensions, which is unarguably simpler than 3-dimensional movement. Once outside of the house, the world becomes 3-dimensional. This shift is conveyed to the player by the height of Link's house up in the tree. The first thing you do outside is jump down to the ground, introducing you to the 3rd dimension. The rest of Kokiri Forest involves climbing on ivy, making your way up ramps, and making easy jumps with no punishment by placing them above water. By automating the jumps themselves, the game is telling you that precision platforming isn't the focus of these jumps, leading us to think that having jumps at all is done for some other reason. Examples later in the game seem to indicate that sectioning off areas with jumps is done more due to creating areas of 3D space by adding depth to a level, rather than testing your platforming skills. Other than introducing you to these gameplay mechanics, it also shows you how to use Zelda's logic. In the first dungeon, there's an example of a torch puzzle where lighting torches opens a door. The game explains this using its own language. Obviously, in reality, we know that lighting a torch doesn't open doors, but the game explains that in this world, it does. Later Zelda games, Twilight Princess for example, do not do this. It expects you to know that lighting the torch will open the door without introducing this concept. For those reasons, I highly recommend Ocarina being someone's first Zelda game. But for you people who've played the game and know back to front, I think it deserves a spot on this list because of its bustling world, its varied dungeon design, its pacing, its story, its lore, its mechanics, everything. This game does everything it's trying to do perfectly. While other Zelda games build on Ocarina's ideas, making it seem more basic in comparison, you have to appreciate that what it does flawlessly. Majora's Mask is considered by many to be one of the greatest games of all time. Speaking of building on Ocarina of Time, Majora is a rare sequel that is intended to be picked up right after its predecessor. The developers have said that the game is supposed to be for those who've played Ocarina of Time and that its difficulty picks up where Ocarina's left off, leading to greater challenges for those who've already beaten Ocarina. Few games do this, and it makes Majora's Mask an interesting game in the history of the industry. That's not the only reason it's interesting. Majora's Mask doesn't just have gameplay and dungeon design to match the rest of the Zelda series, it has the heart and character that far surpass any other game I've ever played. The game is based on a 3-day cycle, and the game's many characters are given things to do, places to go, and things to save for each hour in these in-game days. Each character has an arc to their story, many of which change based on your actions, and these actions can reset every 3 days, letting you see every outcome. Majora's Mask cycle hasn't been replicated in any major games since then. In our modern day, good versus evil paths and multiple endings are nothing compared to Majora's Mask's intertwining narratives. The game is a personal quest for Link while also being a story about the world, which isn't Hyrule. It's an Alice in Wonderland style interpretation of Hyrule, and the differences of that world compared to the world of Ocarina of Time create yet another level of interpretation that couldn't be possible if Majora's Mask wasn't a direct sequel. Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time are truly the Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back of gaming. It's impossible to talk about them not as a pair because they both do different things and yet come from the same place. And what Majora's Mask is to Empire Strikes Back, the next game is to Rogue One, a Star Wars story. A prequel to the series, but Ocarina of Time specifically, Skyward Sword aims to answer questions raised in the previous games and questions that no one knew that they had, like who Hylia was and the nature of Ganondorf's past. Story-wise, Skyward Sword plays off the other games in an interesting way. It's the first 3D game where you get the entire Triforce, which seems like a great payoff, but it's also the first game in the timeline, so technically the world hasn't been through any other tough times to warrant using the Triforce as a payoff mechanic. In this instance, the game as it stands in the timeline and the game as it stands released in the real world created a conflict in how the player should feel about the game's ending. It's impossible to talk about Skyward Sword without mentioning the controls. The perfect controls that don't cause any problems. No, seriously, I had no problems with Skyward Sword's controls. I recalibrated the remote maybe 5 times throughout the 40-hour game and never felt that Link was doing something I didn't want him to do. It's a complicated conversation to have with people because everyone's experiences with the game is legitimate, but it makes you wonder how much is user input and how much is hardware. Can you blame the game if your Wii isn't picking up your Wiimote correctly? Or can you blame the game if you just had rotator cuff surgery and can't do what the game is asking? Those are questions without clear answers. But if played in the correct environment, Skyward Sword's controls are super engaging. I remember that at the time I was playing Skyward Sword and Skyrim concurrently, and I found it incredibly jarring to go from Skyward Sword's combat back to the hack-and-slash button presses of Skyrim. I never wanted to play a game without one-on-one sword controls again. The game's puzzles and enemies were designed perfectly around what Link could do now that he could move his sword in 360 degrees, and the developers weren't shy about exploring everything that the player could do. The game is often noted as not having the same elements of exploration as every other 3D Zelda game, but the space between dungeons are like dungeons themselves, with progression blocked by puzzles and enemies just like a traditional dungeon. The most linear of the Zelda games, Skyward Sword focuses on letting the player do what they want and tackle obstacles how they want, instead of going wherever they want. Speaking of going wherever they want, we're on to the final game on our list of top 5 3D Zelda games. The long-awaited sequel to A Link to the Past graced us on the 3DS in 2013 and showed us what the Zelda devs were thinking at the time. The game was based around the notion of going to dungeons in any order and utilized a system where you can buy items instead of getting them in a dungeon. This is the first 2D beta version of what Ionuma seems to be going for in Breath of the Wild. While light on story, A Link Between Worlds builds on the series' lore by introducing Lorule, an alternate dimension that is alternate versions of Hyrule citizens. Like Majora's Mask's Termina, only different. Maybe. A Link Between Worlds is marred by the already existing Zelda timeline because of its placement after A Link to the Past, but before the original Zelda, it means that no matter what you do to stop evil, the events of the first Zelda where Hyrule is destroyed will still happen. It will probably take years to fully understand A Link Between Worlds and how it interacts with the series, but it's a worthy entry in the list of best 3D Zelda games. Thanks for watching. For more Zelda, get off YouTube and go play the games. Also, I have a new video out next week about it.